The future of the Falcons hinges on their offseason approach and their ability to strike a balance between short term and long term gain.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Locked On Falcons, which is part of the Locked On Podcast Network, now the #1 sports podcast network in the galaxy. Of course, I am your humble host, Aaron Freeman, aka the Jolly Green Giant. Been covering the Atlanta Falcons for 2 decades, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP. Still going strong here on Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. And on today's daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, we are talking all about the balance between the short-term and long-term success of this team and their offseason approach. The coordinators have spoken, and we'll get into some of the things that jumped out to me from Jeff Ulbrich and Tommy Rees that sort of inform those short-term and long-term decisions that they'll be making. We'll get into the potential of the team's investment in the trenches, Kaden Elliss' potential return, and how Tommy Rees can help raise the ceiling of this offense by, being able to upgrade to specific positions. But we heard the Falcons coordinators, all 3 coordinators, speak, in Jeff Ulbrich, their defensive coordinator, Tommy Rees, their offensive coordinator, and Craig Ackerman, their special teams coordinator. We'll probably talk a little bit more about the special teams on the next episode of the podcast, but let's focus on what Jeff Ulbrich said. And a couple of things stood out to me where he talked about how excited he was with the defensive line. He sort of cited how the best defensive lines in football were all playoff teams that went really far, specifically naming Houston, New England, and Seattle, and sort of talking about how he loves what he's hearing from head coach Kevin Stefanski and new general manager Ian Cunningham about their wanting and desire to invest in the trenches. And so it makes you feel excited that the Falcons will continue to invest in the defensive front and build it front to back, as Jeff Ulbrich stated in today's presser. And, that gets us to what I want to talk about. And this is less of an issue when they talk specifically about the defensive line when it comes to investing in that side of the ball. We know the Falcons are going to invest in their defensive line because we know that Jeff Ulbrich wants to have a strong 8 to 10 man rotation in order to run his defensive system, as we saw them successfully do last year. And right now, when you look at that defensive line rotation based off of the guys that are under contract and or the guys that are not in legal trouble, you only can really feel confident about 4 of those 8 to plus pieces, right? Jalen Walker, Ruka Roro, Brandon Douglas, and Zach Harrison. And so your defensive line, you're going to need to add to that room or at least replenish that room already somewhat this offseason. But this short-term and long-term thinking manifests a little bit more and is a little bit more applicable when you talk about building on the other side of the trenches, which is the offensive line, where the Falcons have 10 guys under contract already, right? All 5 starters, or really 9 out of 11 guys are under contract. That's my bad. 5 starters and 4 of their backups, right? It's basically Elijah Wilkinson and Javon Gwynn are the only guys of the 11 that aren't under contract, because Storm Norton, Jack Nelson, Mike Jarrell, and Kyle Hinton are all under contract. And so there really isn't that much room for the Falcons to invest in the offensive line in terms of that paying off in 2026, right? They could certainly draft players, but I don't see this team spending big in free agency when it comes to the offensive line and a lot of positions this offseason. But like, if you invest in the draft in the offensive line, that bet is not going to pay. That investment's not going to pay off until 2027, 2028, and potentially beyond. And it's a similar conversation with the defensive line, just because you want to sort of strengthen that unit. And like, you're probably not one offseason of big spending in free agency trying to close the gap between the Falcons' current defensive line and the Seahawks or the Texans' defensive line as they stand right now, to try to catch up with those teams. And even if you do invest, it's going to be very pricey, right? We've seen nose tackles, right? That's a big area of concern for this Falcons defensive line. But Teer Tart just got a $10 million contract. Travis Jones signed a $13 million contract with the Titans and Ravens respectively. And so even if you do try to upgrade those positions in the free agency, you're going to spend a pretty penny on that. So, the point is really, I'm curious to see how they approach this offseason. The trenches kind of, embody that a little bit, but it's really about that balancing the short term versus long term. We heard Matt Ryan talk about that. That was one of the things, their goals of being able to build a team that, is good in the short term, but also is good in the long term. I think Ian Cunningham echoed those sentiments at his introductory presser. And there's a lot of room for growth for the Falcons in those areas in the trenches. But right now you look at the team's needs there in the trenches and you go, they have a little bit more pressing needs at other positions. Like, who's going to be the starter at quarterback in week 1? They need to remake and remodel this wide receiver room. They need to upgrade the cornerback room, all those various things. And it's like, you can probably get by with the current options, again, tweaking and replenishing a little bit on the defensive line, but you could probably run it back with this offensive line and defensive line and at least get by in 2026. But the question is, of course, beyond that point, right? 2027, 2028, that's where the questions around the trenches are. And so it's going to be that balance of, do you invest in the trenches knowing that that's more of a long-term investment, or do you invest in some of these other areas of weakness that are need help a little bit more immediately? That's more of that short term. And so I typically tend to think more long-term in terms of my vision for what I would like to see the Falcons do. I talk to a lot of Falcon fans that seem to have the opposite perspective, which tends to be a little bit more short term. And I think some of that is subconsciously, because I don't think they would consciously say, oh, like, I'm thinking only short term. But, I feel like, a lot of people's approach, whether they acknowledge it or not, kind of is the same approach that we have talked about on this podcast that the Falcons have had overwhelmingly these last several years, which is that mindset of, this team is already 80% up the mountain, right? And like, to me, this mindset got Terry Fontenot fired. And so my assumption is that the new regime is not going to do it the same way that Terry did it. And they're going to take more of that long-term approach, focus on the draft, dial back their spending a little bit. Yeah, they'll pay some guys, Bijan, Drake, but they're probably not going to hand out any other big contracts this offseason, as I assume right now. And, we've talked about this 8-year playoff drought, and, I know for a lot of Falcon fans, if they don't end this 8-year playoff drought this year, if that 8-year playoff drought goes to 9 years, they're immediately going to be out on Kevin Stefanski, right? Because he was already a polarizing hire. And if he doesn't deliver the goods immediately, they're going to be like, out. I'm going to pull the parachute. I get that. I don't agree with it, but I get it, right? I'm much more of a process over results guy, or the ends don't necessarily justify the means. And like, there's a world where the Falcons only win 7 games, but we're also excited about their future, right? There's also a world where the Falcons win 9 or 10 games and we're more pessimistic about their future. And so it's about that balance. And like, we know when Raheem Morris came in 2024, there were like basically 2 mandates from ownership: figure out the quarterback position and win now, right? Because again, this organization was operating like, we've done 80% of the legwork to build a playoff team. And so we just got to tweak it a little bit. And I'm curious if that mandate still exists for this new regime, right? We'll probably get a little bit more insight into that once we get to the combine in a couple of weeks, right? We'll get some more interviews from Kevin Stefanski and Ian Cunningham that may help us delineate whether or not there is that sort of imperative and pressure to win right away, or can they sort of, be willing, not necessarily take a step back, but maybe hold serve with the idea of, we're building more towards long-term, where our eyes are on 2028 and being the best team that we can be in 2028, as opposed to being the best team we can be in 2026, right? And it's like, it'll be interesting to see that at the combine, because 2 years ago when Raheem came in the building, that's where we really heard Raheem sort of step up his "we're just a quarterback away" rhetoric, right? And for those of you that missed that episode that we did a couple of weeks ago about the mountain and 80% of the mountain, the quick cliff notes of that is basically the Falcons operate like they've already built 80% of the team, and they're 80% of the way to the mountain. So they only put in like 20% of the work to get to the top of the mountain. But the reality is that they don't realize is that they're only 50 to 60% up the mountain. And so when they only put in 20% of the work, they only wind up, 70 or 80% of the way of the mountain. And that's not reaching the top, which is their goal of, making the playoffs or whatever. And they wind up freezing to death on the side of the mountain. And that's why they keep coming up short. And that's not just the issue that has been a Raheem Morris issue over the last 2 years, but that's been a issue that this team has had, and the mentality that this team has had for the last 8 years. That, to me, that is the through line when it comes to why this team is on an 8-year playoff drought. But, you guys know it takes a lot for me to be optimistic about this team's future. because I was joking with some folks in the Locked On Falcons Discord earlier today, is that like the Falcons mediocrity is like a black hole, right? They just cannot escape the gravity of this sort of black hole of mediocrity. And there's got to be something that's going to nudge them out of that, gravity well, if you're following me and whatnot. And sort of hearing Ian Cunningham say, hey, we don't think the cupboard is bare, but we got to add more to it. And if we're using, whether we're using the mountain or the cupboard analogy, to me, if they approach it where the cupboard is 80% stocked, then they're going to probably wind up falling short. If they approach it more like the cupboard is only 50% stocked, I think that gives me a lot more optimism that this team is on the right path and that they can nudge themselves out of that gravity well and get past the event horizon, if you understand the black hole reference. And so to me, the amount of effort that they have to put in immediately to make sure that this is fully stocked right away in terms of the short term, I don't think it's really worth it for them. And right, some of that is owed to the quarterback, and we'll circle back to that when we get to the Tommy Rees portion of the conversation later in the episode. But like, to me, this is going to be kind of the lens that we discuss this team's offseason moves and more than likely over the next few months, which is this decision that the Falcons are making, whether it's a cut, a signing, a trade, a draft pick, or what. Obviously a draft pick, we know where that bucket that falls into, but it may lean one way or the other. We'll see. But like, it's going to be, is this a long-term bet or is this a short-term bet? And I think it's going to be fascinating to see where that balance is. They're going to make both, right? Short and long-term bets. But it's going to be, where does the balance go? Are there more long-term bets or are there more short-term bets? Is it perfectly even? That's going to be a fascinating thing to break down this offseason. But one of those potential short-term bets that they will be probably making, it sounds like, is bringing back Kaden Elliss. And is that all but guaranteed given the uncertainty surrounding James Pearson? We'll break that down as we wrap up today or continue today's Locked On Falcons. So wouldn't it be nice if doing your taxes was just as easy as it looks when Bijan Robinson is toting that rock? With TurboTax Full Service, it now is. You can hand off your taxes to a local expert and not have to stress from start to finish, just like when you hand the ball off to Bijan Robinson and do not have to stress about letting that man cook. Instead of spending hours trying to figure out your forms, you can meet with a local TurboTax expert in person or connect online. They're going to handle everything from W-2s to self-employment forms, and they're going to work to get you every deduction. All you got to do is upload your documents, go about the rest of your day, and get the updates right in the TurboTax app. It's a huge time saver, and it gives you real peace of mind knowing an expert is handling it, just like you get peace of mind every time Bijan plays football. For a limited time, get your taxes done by a local TurboTax expert for just $150 all in. If a TurboTax expert didn't file for you last year, just file by February 28th. Take taxes off your plate and get back to your life by visiting turbotax.com/local to book your appointment today. So I want to thank each and every one of you guys that is an everydayer of this podcast. You are the reason why Locked On is the #1 sports podcast network in all of the galaxy. And you can level up by joining the Everydayer Club at the link in the description below. That's lockedonfalcons.supercast.com. It's just $5 a month or $50 a year. And you get so many perks, like an ad-free version of the podcast, Locked On Podcast Network Discord access, as well as some sweet Locked On merch. And go check it out at the link in the description below. So one of the other things that Jeff Ulbrich talked about in his presser today was he was asked about Kaden Elliss, and he basically waxed poetic about how incredible a person Kaden Elliss is and how versatile a player he is and how valuable he is to this team, and basically said, we want him back, point blank. That settles it, right? That was the question. It was like, is Kaden Elliss coming back? And Jeff Ulbrich basically just said, right, he is coming back. And so normally this is the point where I would say on this podcast, well, guys, not so fast, my friend. That would be my normal response, but we're not going to do that today, because I think it totally makes sense that the Falcons, in lieu of certain recent actions by a certain soon to be second year Falcons pass rusher, would completely want Kaden Elliss, right? We've talked a little bit about some of the reasons why you would want Kaden Elliss. We won't go too deeply into some of the other reasons that you would want Kaden Elliss. I do want to kind of save that for a future episode, because we're going to do like a series on keeper or let certain free agents walk. So we'll get more into that between now and March. But, we could sort of likened it to simple. It's a simple question, right? If you want a 4-man rush, then let Kaden Elliss walk. If you want to still continue to be blitz happy, then you re-sign Kaden Elliss. And so, I have a similar opinion of Kaden Elliss as Jeff Ulbrich seems to have, but this is going back to what we were talking about just now. This is kind of a short-term bet, right? You're not re-signing Kaden Elliss thinking that this is a long-term solution at the linebacker position. This is really a short-term bet, and that also applies to their pass rush, right? Kaden Elliss is going to be 31 in July. We saw some signs of decline in the second half of the season as a pass rusher, but simply it boils down to you're not getting the same Kaden Elliss over the next 2 to 3 years that Jeff Ulbrich and I, share such a passion over the Kaden Elliss that we've gotten over the last 2 to 3 years. And so if you're going to maximize the remaining window that you have Kaden Elliss, which may be 1 or 2 more good years left in him, you're going to embrace the blitz. You're going to embrace that 5-man rush. And even with the decline, you still want to embrace that, should Kaden Elliss not be the same pass rusher where he's been the best blitzing off-ball linebacker in the NFL for the last 2 or 3 years. Like, I don't think he's going to fall off a cliff or anything like that moving forward, but he may not be number 1. He might be, I don't know, number 6 or something like that, right? So, even if that you do suffer that fall off, you still want to embrace the blitz because that is still the thing that Kaden Elliss is going to do best. And that is the thing that is probably going to age the best in terms of Kaden Ellis' skill set, as opposed to, sort of being the run defender, being the coverage guy. And so, when this Falcon team was rushing 5 in 2025, they were number 1 in sacks across the league, number 3 in pressures, and number 9 in pressure rate. And basically until Ellis's productions dipped after that week 11 Carolina game, they were actually number 4 in pressure rate when rushing 5. And so, if you keep Elliss, your goal is to maintain that. We're going to be number 1, we're going to be top 5 in all of those areas when we rush 5 in 2026. And again, a lot of this is attached to the unknown future of James Pierce, right? Like, you could really buy into the idea of like, we're going to build a great 4-man pass rush if James Pierce was part of that. But right now, you're sitting here at best saying it's a toss-up. It's a coin toss on whether or not James Pierce is going to continue to be a part of this football team, not just in 2026, but beyond, right? And so your hand is kind of forced when it comes to keeping Kaden Elliss, right? That if you're not going to keep Kaden Elliss, then you're going to have to spend a lot of resources this offseason to try to maintain your pass rush, right? And, we talked a little bit about, whether Arnold Ebiketie was some of those resources that you could spend. But even if you don't want to pay for Arnold Ebiketie, as so many of you guys in the comments on yesterday's episode suggested that you don't, right? If you lose AK, you lose Pierce, you lose Floyd, you lose Onyemata, and you lose Kaden Elliss on top of that. We've already talked about the potential for regression for this pass rush. Like, the potential for regression is going to be massive if you lose all of those guys. And so you got to keep at least one of those guys. And that guy being Kaden Elliss makes a ton of sense, because when you look at this 4-man rush without those guys, it's like Jalen Walker, Zach Harrison, Brandon Doris, Rukaroro. Again, not a bunch of scrubs, but that 4-man rush ain't scaring anybody, right? And even if you draft a guy, it's, let's say in round 2 with your top selection at pick 48, right? The reality is you're hoping that guy turns into a Arnold Ebiketie-like player, right? You're going to get a rookie version of Arnold Ebiketie with that player more than likely than necessarily the fully formed, fully developed Arnold Ebiketie that is going into year 5 this year. So that is also a potential regression for you at this point in time. And so, the Falcons' hand is basically forced. They're going to have to embrace the blitz in the short term because of the unreliability of James Pierce until they can kind of figure out the 4-man rush, get a clearer picture on the future of this 4-man rush, which a lot of that is attached to what James Pierce's status is going to be moving forward. But even if James Pierce isn't suspended, he's exonerated, it's going to be really hard to trust that guy moving forward as a guy that you can rely on to be a core part of your 4-man rush or your defense moving forward. So before we thought keeping Kaden Elliss was a bit of a toss-up. Now we're not going to sit here and say it's a slam dunk. It's going to be 100% guaranteed to come back. But we're going to sit here and say, like, this is probably 80% of the way up the mountain, where it's just like, yeah, unless, Kaden Elliss, yeah, we'll see what the circumstances is. Again, just because Jeff Ulbrich wants to keep Kaden Elliss does not guarantee that Ian Cunningham is going to be like, nah, man, we ain't doing that. But, I would say the odds of that happening are much, much lower than we were sitting here maybe a week ago. So I think Kaden Elliss will be back. We will be operating on this podcast moving forward between now and free agency, unless something else major comes up. Like, Kaden Elliss will be back in the Falcons uniform in 2026. And so, for me, I have no complaints about that, but it is going to be something that when we talk about that, will the Falcons make that short-term bet, but then, probably in the draft, also make a long-term bet at the linebacker position. That will be an open question, but we will, cross that bridge if and when we get to it come March and April. So we will move on from Jeff Ulbrich's presser and talk about some of the things that stood out to me with Tommy Rees's presser. And Tommy Rees, he's sort of reaffirming what this team's identity is going to be, which is involving the run game. And basically, that to me is going to set the floor for what this offense is going to be. But when we have a conversation on what's going to set the ceiling, that's going to revolve around the quarterback and wide receiver position. And we'll break that down as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So the winter games are officially here, and I know you guys are going to be locked into these events that you only get to see on the biggest stage every 4 years since it's the Olympics. The drama, the intensity is there, and FanDuel is going to give you the most ways to stay connected. It's going to allow you to be fully locked into this competition. And, today I had the winter games on in the background as I was going about my day, and they had 2-man and 2-woman luge and snowboarding, and I'll be the first one to admit I know absolutely nothing about these sports, but I can stay locked in with FanDuel, be invested in who's going to win, whether I'm out here supporting my home country or, just looking at some, underdogs that I'm just betting on. I can head on over to FanDuel. So check them out, guys. The winter games are on, and there's no better way to follow them than with FanDuel at FanDuel.com. FanDuel, play your game. So the thing that stood out to me with Tommy Rees's presser is basically he was asked about what the identity of this Falcons team is going to be. And he's like, we believe in running the football and we believe in marrying the run game with the pass game. Basically, we believe in run and play action. Right. And it's like, okay, yep. This is reaffirming what we already knew about what a Kevin Stefanski offense looks like. Right. We know that when that Browns team was at its most successful across his first 4 years in Cleveland, what were they known for? What was the identity of that football team? It was all about Nick Chubb and one of the best offensive lines in football. And we hope to see a similar story here with Bijan Robinson and a revamped, reloaded, reset, whatever you want to call it, offensive line here under Bill Callahan. And to me, the run game is going to really set the floor for what this team is going to be, which it was what I think it did in Cleveland. And I think the years when the Browns were at their most effective, right, winning games and going to the postseason, those were the years where they got just a little bit more from their passing game. And that to me is really going to determine the ceiling of this football team, right? Those Browns teams, their floor was typically, 7-8 wins early on with their run game operating it is, but they obviously had a couple of years where they won 10, 11 games, and that was driven by their passing attack. And I think it's going to be an exact same story here in Atlanta. Now, when it comes to what's going to raise the ceiling, right, we're operating, the floor is going to be really high with Bijan, with Bill Callahan, and hopefully, some of the pieces on this offensive line and a few more hopeful upgrades on this offensive line that are, coming in the near future. But what is going to raise the ceiling for this team is going to be what can Tommy Rees and Kevin Stefanski get out of the quarterback and what can they get out of the wide receiver. And going back to what I touched upon briefly at the beginning of the show, when it comes to the quarterback, part of the reason why I'm not as sold on the short-term upside of the Atlanta Falcons and why you consistently hear me talk about, 2026 is going to be this evaluation year for the Falcons, as opposed to a year where the Falcons are trying to push their chips into the middle of the table. Now, again, maybe Ian Cunningham and Kevin Stefanski have a very different outlook, but I'm assuming that they're going to use this year as an evaluation year, is because when it comes to the quarterback position, you're probably not going to get the best version of Michael Penix this year. There's no real reason to bet on, hey, Michael Penix is going to really elevate this team's ceiling. Again, this not means that Michael Penix can't play well this season, but you're not going to get the best version of Michael Penix in all likelihood this year, right? This is going to be his first year in a brand new offense. He's not going to have much of an offseason because he's recovering from that injury. And then the fact that he's coming off of that injury is also going to have some potentially negative impact on his performance this upcoming season. Now, again, that doesn't mean Michael Penix is doomed to suck this year, but there's no reason, again, to think that this is going to be the best version of 2026 Michael Penix is going to be the best version of him, right? Now, if we had a 10-year veteran that had 150-plus career starts, right, we might feel a little bit more confident that guy could hit the ground running because they have the experience, but because Michael Penix only has 12 starts, there's no reason for us to think that. Now, Again, there's not a saying there's a 0% chance that Penix is good this year, but nobody should be going into 2026 expecting the best version of him, right? And that's going to be the thing that's going to raise the ceiling for this football team in the ways that we're talking about, right? Instead, when you're betting on Michael Penix, you're betting really on a 2027 payoff for that bet, right? It's because he's going to have a full year in the offense. He's going to hopefully have a full off season to be able to, coming off the injury, and then he's going to be fully healthy. And you should be able to get much more of that ceiling raising play from the quarterback if in the form of Michael Penix in 2027 than you are going to get in 2026. Then the other factor that factors into that shifts us to the wide receiver position is who's Michael Penix in 2026 going to be throwing to? Like, we know Drake's going to be there. We know Bijan's going to be there. Who else, right? Kyle Pitts, right? And again, we're not going to get into it on today's episode, but to me, the decision to keep Kyle Pitts versus let him walk really kind of embodies the short-term versus long-term mindset when it comes to this team. Like, if you want to keep Kyle Pitts, that's much more to me of a short-term mindset. If you let Kyle Pitts walk, you're thinking more long-term in that regard. And again, we can unpack that at a future date. Then you talk about who's going to be your wide receiver too. Is that going to be Darnell Mooney, right? Certainly, I think there's a world where the Falcons keep Darnell Mooney. I think a lot of us, including myself, have been operating for weeks that Darnell Mooney is cutting him is a foregone conclusion. But maybe the Falcons sit here and go like, oh, because we don't want to necessarily, we want to have a chance to maximize, Penix even in this year where we're not necessarily going to get the best version of him. Keeping Darnell Mooney makes sense. Giving him a reliable is probably not the correct word to use based off of last year. But, I could see the Falcons going to Darnell Mooney and saying, hey, Darnell, we need you to take a pay cut, right? You're not worth whatever his cap hit. I think it's like 18 million or something like that. And if he takes the pay cut, then you say, okay, we'll keep you for a lesser price, more what you're worth at this point in time. And if he doesn't, then he gets cut and then you move on, right? And so I think when we talk about this wide receiver room, because it's basically Drake London and then not a whole lot else at this point in time, I think it's going to take multiple off seasons kind of reload this thing and refill this thing, rather than just thinking, oh, we're going to be able to figure it all out now. But I think that's going to be a big part. That reloading of the wide receiver room is going to be a big part of this regime's success, their ability to draft and develop wide receivers, right? When you look at Kevin Stefanski's success and history in Cleveland, he had most of his success with veteran wide receivers. It was the Jerry Judys, it was the Amari Coopers, it was the Odell Beckhams. You go back to his time in Minnesota, it was veteran receivers like Stephon Diggs and Adam Thielen that had the most success in their offense. Now, it doesn't mean that Stefanski was bad at developing young, or it's a bad coach because no young wide receivers, developed in his offense. You can certainly argue that like his failure at developing a bunch of mid and late round wide receivers in Cleveland is not a reflection of his ability as a coach, right? Just because he couldn't maximize those guys. But it is one of those things, it's got to be a little bit different this time, right? And then you look at the wide receivers coach in Robert Prince. When you look at his most successful stint as a wide receivers coach, which came in Detroit, it was with veterans like Calvin Johnson and Golden Tate and Marvin Jones Jr., et cetera. And part of that is owed to the fact that Robert Prince hasn't really been in one spot long enough to really develop a wide receiver in any one spot. But that's neither here nor there. But again, I think if the Falcons are going to reach their ceiling, they're going to have to do a better job developing that young wide receiver talent than what Stefanski was able to do in Cleveland with the Cedric Tillmans and the Anthony Schwartzes and, the Donovan Peoples-Joneses and all those various guys. And you can look back at his history in Cleveland, where you look at some of his best years, where what that passing game was, it was when they had Odell Beckham Jr. and Jarvis Landry operating at a high level, when Amari Cooper was out here being a one-man wrecking crew at that wide receiver one position. And so I think you can tie a lot of their success in terms of the years where they actually had a above average passing attack, because most of those years, particularly the last 3 years, they had a very below average passing attack in Cleveland. And a lot of it to me was attached to the quality of receivers that they had. And so, we focus on those diminishing returns in Cleveland from a passing standpoint and say, oh, well, they just had bad quarterback play, which is probably the biggest part of it. But I do think we can't undersell how much their inconsistency at the wide receiver position also contributed to those issues. And so if we sit here and go, this time it's going to be different, it won't all be because of Michael Penix in the quarterback position. That's going to be the bulk of it, but it's also going to be their ability to find and develop dynamic weapons at that wide receiver position and do a better job developing those young up and coming, dynamic weapons in Atlanta than they did in Cleveland. And so hearing Tommy Rees double down on the run game and the play action, it's like, all right, that's cool. That's what I expect, but that's not really any different than what the Falcons have been in the last 3 or 4 years, right? It's kind of like, what else you got, my guy? Because we've had a good run game, and at various points in the last 4 years, we've had good play action passing games. We had one of the best play action passing games in the NFL for the last 11 games of last year, right? We were above average in 2022 as well. So it's one of those things where it's just like, what else are you going to bring to the table? And if this team is going to break that cycle of mediocrity that I've been suggesting that they have been in for the last 8 years, I think their ability to get more out of the quarterback position and more out of the wide receiver position than we saw this same regime get in Cleveland is going to play a huge part of that. So those are my thoughts on what we heard from these coordinators. I didn't think I was going to talk about Craig Ackerman, the special teams coordinator, and what he had to say, but then the Falcons hired Chase Blackburn, and I'm like, okay, like I guess we got to talk about, is the vision for special teams, is it clear? Like, are we liking where the direction we're headed in? And we'll get into that more on our next episode of the podcast. So continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen by checking us out on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. Check out Locked On NFL to get the latest from around the league. And of course, check out the link in the description below to join the Everydayer Club. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.